Umberto II of Italy. He was a king for 34 days. Not 34 years, 34 days. History remembers him as the May King because his entire reign fit inside a single spring. Umberto came to the throne on the 9th of May, 1946, when his father finally abdicated and handed him a crown that was already slipping. Italy had just come through the war. The monarchy was tangled up in the memory of fascism, and the country had had enough of kings. So they put it to a vote. On the 2nd of June, Italians chose a republic over the monarchy, roughly 54 to 46. Umberto could have dug in. He could have called on the army and turned it into a fight. He said instead that his house had united Italy, and he would not be the one to divide it. Then he left. He left on the 13th of June and settled in Cascais on the coast of Portugal, where he lived for 37 years under a smaller title, the Count of Sar. And here is the part that turns a sad story into a cruel one. 2 years after he left, the new republic wrote its constitution, and into that constitution it wrote a line banning every male heir of his house from Italian soil. Not for a year, not for a decade. The ban outlived him. It was not lifted until 2002, and by then he had been dead for 19 years. There is one small image that says all of it. In 1954, when the royal houses of Europe took a cruise together, Umberto's family could board the ship only at a port in Greece because they were not allowed to so much as touch Italian ground. Umberto died in Geneva on the 18th of March, 1983, close enough to Italy to see it on a map, never once allowed to cross back into it. They buried him at an abbey in France. The cruelest detail, to me, is not the coup or the vote. It is that a country can be so afraid of one man that it makes his exile a law. He did not lose an argument. He lost the right to ever come home. In writing. Number 9. Thibaw Min, the last king of Burma. Picture a bullock cart rolling out of a palace at dusk, carrying a king, a queen, and everything left of a dynasty that had ruled for centuries. That was how it ended for Thibaw. Not with a battle, with a cart. He came to the throne in 1878, and it came to him soaked in blood, secured by a palace massacre of dozens of rivals so that no one could challenge him. He ruled Upper Burma while the British already held the south, and in 1885 they came for the rest. The Third Anglo-Burmese War barely lasted a fortnight. British troops marched into Mandalay, and on the 29th of November, Thibaw surrendered. The monarchy of Burma ended in that moment, and it has never come back. They shipped him to Ratnagiri, a remote town on the coast of India, about 3,000 miles from home, chosen for one reason. It was almost impossible to escape. He lived there under guard, watched, shrinking, for the rest of his life. At the surrender, he had handed over his most precious possession, a ruby called the Nuga Mauk, a stone said to be worth a kingdom. It passed into a British officer's hands, and then it vanished, and to this day no one can say where it went. The family that once owned it was reduced to selling off jewels just to get by. Years later, a granddaughter would survive by making paper flowers to sell in a market. Thibaw died in exile in December of 1916. After some 30 years in that coastal town, the British would not send his body home, afraid that even a dead king might stir the country toward independence. His family was finally allowed back in 1919. He never was. What gets me about Thibaw is the ruby. It stands in for the whole thing. Everything he had was carried off and never seen again. And in the end, that included him. Number 8. King Zog of Albania. Here is a man who reportedly survived more than 50 attempts on his life and carried hundreds of blood feuds against his name and still died quietly in a hospital bed of natural causes, which might be the most surprising thing about him. Zog did not inherit a throne. He took one. He was a prime minister, then a president, and in 1928, He simply turned the republic into a monarchy and crowned himself king, which made him the only Muslim monarch in Europe. He modernized where he could and leaned on Mussolini's Italy where he felt he had to, and that second choice is what undid him. On the 7th of April, 1939, Italy invaded. Albania fell in days. Zog ran. He did not run empty-handed. As the family fled, they carried gold out of the national bank, enough to keep a king comfortable, though how much has been argued over ever since. What followed was a long, strange tour of exile. Greece, then England, then Egypt, where he was taken in as a guest of the king there, a man named Farouk. Hold on to that name. We come back to him further up this list, because his own ending was already on its way. The stories around Zog are almost too colorful to trust, and some should be taken with care. The most famous has him drawing a pistol and firing back during an assassination attempt outside the Vienna Opera, though even that is disputed by people who were there. What is not disputed is that his mother ran his kitchen herself, tasting for poison, because that was the level of caution his life required. He died at a hospital near Paris on the 9th of April, 1961. His last words on Albanian soil, years before, had been that it was all so short. His country would not bring him home until 2012, when they finally dug him up and carried him to a new tomb in Tirana. I have a soft spot for Zog, and it is this. The man spent his whole life braced to be killed, and the thing that finally beat him was an ordinary illness in an ordinary bed, far from the country that had spent so long trying to do the job itself. Number 7. Dom Pedro II of Brazil. When the soldiers came to tell him it was over, he did not rage, and he did not beg. He said, more or less, that if this was how it was going to be, then he would treat it as his retirement and go and rest. That was the last emperor of Brazil, meeting the end of his world with a shrug and a sad kind of grace. Pedro had been emperor almost his entire life. He took the throne as a boy of 5 in 1831, and he ruled for close to 58 years, the longest and steadiest reign the country ever had. Under him, Brazil grew, modernized, and finally abolished slavery. Then, on the 15th of November, 1889, a bloodless military coup swept it all away in a single morning. 2 days later, he was on a warship bound for Europe, an emperor with no empire. Exile took him apart piece by piece. His wife, the Empress Teresa Cristina, died within weeks, in late December of that same year. Pedro spent his final 2 years drifting through modest Paris hotels, writing in his journal about a homeland he was not allowed to see. He died of pneumonia in one of those hotels on the 5th of December, 1891. By the accounts that survive, his last words were a wish for the peace and prosperity of Brazil, the country that had just cast him out. And then they found the package. In his room was a bundle he had kept close, wrapped and labeled in his own hand. It was soil from Brazil, set aside so that if he died away from home, at least some of home could go into the coffin with him. There is a dignity there I did not expect to find. He would not lift a finger to take his crown back by force, even when supporters begged him to. But he could not stop himself from carrying his country in a bag, just in case they never let him return alive. They did not. His remains went home decades later. Number 6. Kigali, the 5th of Rwanda. Walk up to a grocery store in a quiet corner of Virginia, sometime in the 2000s. Out front, at noon, stands a man nearly 7 feet tall, patient and friendly, known to the neighbors as the King of Africa. They think it is a nickname. It is not. He truly was a king. Kigali V was the last monarch of Rwanda. He came to the throne in 1959 as a grown man of 23, in the middle of a country tearing itself apart along ethnic lines. His reign was short and doomed. A coup in 1961, backed by the colonial administration, abolished the monarchy while he was out of the country, and a referendum that same year made it final. He was locked out of his own kingdom and never got back in. What followed was more than 50 years of exile, first across East Africa, then, from 1992, in the United States, where he was granted asylum and settled in a town in Northern Virginia. This is where the story stops sounding like history and starts sounding impossible. A king, an anointed monarch of an ancient line, lived out his years in subsidized housing, getting by on food stamps and the kindness of people who cared. He handed chocolates to the children on his street. He kept asking to go home. Home said no in its way. The government in Rwanda told him he was welcome to return, but only as a private citizen, never again as king. He would not accept that, so he stayed, and he died in exile on the 16th of October, 2016. Only then did he finally go back, buried in Rwanda in early 2017, and even then without the honors a king is given. I keep coming back to that grocery store. A man raised to be sacred, spending his afternoons in a parking lot, being kind to strangers who had no idea they were talking to the last king of a nation. Enjoying this? Subscribe. New history every week. Number 5. King Farouk of Egypt. He began as a beloved boy king, handsome and young, the hope of a nation. He ended as a man an old acquaintance, described as a stomach with a head. The distance between those two Farouks is the whole story. Farouk took the throne of Egypt in 1936. At 16, for a while the country adored him. Then came the corruption, the humiliating defeat to Israel in 1948, and his own runaway appetites for food, for gambling, for excess of every kind. By the summer of 1952, the army had lost patience. On the 23rd of July, the free officers seized power, and 3 days later, they forced Farouk to abdicate in favor of his infant son, a baby who was king in name for less than a year. Farouk sailed out of Alexandria on the royal yacht. And remember, one of his own guests in the good years had been King Zog, the Albanian we just met, sheltered in Egypt on his own long road through exile. Now it was Farouk's turn to walk that road. He walked it in style. Exile for Farouk meant Italy and Monaco, casinos and restaurants, and a life built entirely around pleasure. He is the one who joked that soon there would be only 5 kings left in the world, the kings of England and of hearts, spades, clubs, and diamonds. His appetites had the last word. On the 18th of March, 1965, in a restaurant in Rome, Farouk finished an enormous midnight meal and slumped dead at the table. He was 45 and grossly overweight. In the end, his body was brought back and laid to rest at a mosque in Cairo, the Rifa'i Mosque. Hold that place in your mind, because someone else on this list is buried there too, and we are almost to him. It is easy to laugh at Farouk, and I do a little, but there is something bleak under the comedy. A man ate and gambled his way through his exile, because the throne, the purpose, the country, all of it was already gone, and pleasure was the only thing left to fill the hole. Number 4. Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last emperor of the Mughals. In a corner of Rangoon, in what used to be Burma, a grave sat for over a century with no marker at all. No name, no stone, nothing to say that under that patch of ground lay the last ruler of one of the greatest empires the world has ever known. That was done on purpose. His jailers wanted him forgotten. Zafar was the 20th Mughal emperor, and by his time the title was nearly hollow. The British held the real power, and his authority reached about as far as the walls of his fort in Delhi. What he truly was a poet, one of the finest of his age. Then, in his 80s, history dropped a rebellion in his lap. In 1857, the soldiers who rose against British rule marched to Delhi and proclaimed the old poet their emperor. For a few months, the figurehead became a symbol. The British crushed the rebellion, and they made him pay for it. They captured him at a tomb outside the city. They shot his sons. They put him on trial inside his own palace, and then they sent him away to Rangoon, across the sea, to a place with no court, no admirers, and no way home. By many accounts, they even kept pen and paper from him, which for a poet is its own kind of prison. There is a famous image of Zafar scratching his verses onto the walls of his cell in charcoal. It may be more legend than fact, but it has lasted because it feels true. What is a throne worth if the man who loses it dies with nothing, not even a name on his grave? He died on the 7th of November, 1862, 87 years old, far from Delhi. They buried him that same day, quickly, in that unmarked plot, precisely so it could never become a shrine, and for a while it worked. The grave was lost entirely, until 1991, when workers digging on the site struck the old brick tomb by accident and found him again. Of everyone on this list, Zafar is the one that sits heaviest with me. Not because he lost the most power, he barely had any left. It is because they took a poet, silenced him, exiled him, and tried to erase the very spot where he lay. For almost 130 years, they nearly got away with it. Number 3. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. The man who helped drag the world into its first global war spent the last 23 years of his life chopping wood in a Dutch garden. Not as a punishment anyone ordered, as a hobby. The locals took to calling him the woodcutter of Dorn. Wilhelm had been the German emperor since 1888, a proud, restless, reckless ruler who dismissed the great Chancellor Bismarck and then steered his country toward the catastrophe of the First World War. When Germany collapsed in 1918, so did he. His abdication was announced on the 9th of November, and days before that he had already fled north, across the border into the neutral Netherlands. The Allies wanted him. The Treaty of Versailles called for him to be put on trial, and there were loud voices demanding he answer for the war. But the Dutch refused to hand him over, so he settled at a country house called Huisdorn, and there he stayed. It was comfortable, and it was a cage all the same. He could travel only a few miles from the estate. He was an emperor-turned-country squire, felling trees to fill the empty days, waiting on a restoration that was never coming. His sympathies in those last years were darker than the gentle woodcutter picture suggests. When German forces overran the Netherlands in 1940, he welcomed the soldiers at his gate, and when Paris fell to Hitler, he sent a telegram of congratulations. He died at Dorn on the 4th of June, 1941, of a blood clot, an old man of 82, with German occupation troops now standing guard at his gate. And here is his final act of stubbornness. He left orders that his body was not to return to Germany until the monarchy was restored. It never was. So he is still there, in the Netherlands, in a small tomb in that same garden, waiting on a condition that will almost certainly never be met. I never quite get over the picture of it. All that ambition, all that noise, all those millions of lives fed into a war he helped start, and the man himself ends up in a quiet Dutch orchard, alone with an axe, chopping wood until his heart gave out. Number 2. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran. For a few terrible months in 1979 and 1980, there was a jet carrying one of the most powerful men on earth, and almost no country on earth would let it land. The Shah of Iran had become something history rarely produces, a man with a fortune, a famous name, and nowhere to go. He had ruled Iran since 1941, and there is a bitter symmetry in how it began, because he only took the throne after his own father was forced to abdicate and sent off to die in exile. Thousands of miles away in South Africa, the son learned the lesson too late. When the Islamic Revolution rose against him in 1979, he left in January, expecting perhaps to wait it out. He never went back. Then came the wandering. Egypt, Morocco, the Bahamas, Mexico. each stay temporary, each door eventually closing behind him. In October, he was allowed into the United States, but only for cancer treatment, and that decision helped set off the seizure of the American embassy in Tehran and the hostage crisis that followed. Suddenly, he was radioactive. Nations that had welcomed him now wanted him gone. He moved on to Panama, and then, at the very end, one man opened a door and kept it open. Anwar Sadat brought him to Egypt and let him stay. The Shah died in Cairo on the 27th of July, 1980, of complications from the cancer that had been eating at him for years. Sadat gave him a state funeral, a thing almost no one else would have offered, and they buried him at the Rifa'i Mosque, the very same mosque in Cairo where Farouk lies, the king from number 5. Two fallen monarchs from two different worlds, resting under the same roof, both of them ending their stories in a country that was not their own. What stays with me is the loneliness of it. He commanded an empire, and at the end he was a sick man on a plane, running through a list of countries in his head, wondering which one might still take him in. Number 1. Napoleon Bonaparte. There is a rock in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, 1,000 miles from anything, wind-scraped and alone. The British chose it on purpose. They needed a place so far from the world that not even Napoleon could find his way off it, because they had made that mistake once already. Napoleon rose out of the chaos of the French Revolution and crowned himself Emperor of the French in 1804, and for a decade he bent most of Europe to his will. When the coalition against him finally won, in 1814, they forced him to abdicate and sent him to the island of Elba. But Elba was a soft exile. He governed it. He kept his title. And within a year, he slipped away, landed in France, raised an army out of thin air, and for 100 days, the emperor was back. Then came Waterloo. On the 18th of June, 1815, the dream ended in a single afternoon. This time, his enemies took no chances. This time, they chose Saint Helena. How do you cage a man who once ruled a continent? You send him to the end of the earth. Napoleon spent his final years in a damp, rat-ridden house called Longwood, watched day and night by a governor who treated him less like a fallen emperor and more like a prisoner, which by then he was. In 1818 it was made official. He would never leave. He would die there. And he did, on the 5th of May, 1821, of stomach cancer, though he himself was certain he had been slowly murdered, and he said as much in his will, blaming the English and the men he believed they had paid to kill him. He asked to be buried on the banks of the Seine, among the French people he had loved. They would not allow even that. He was buried on the island. It took 19 years before France finally brought him home, in 1840, to the tomb in Paris, where he lies today. Napoleon is number 1 for a simple reason. He is the template. Every exile on this list, the kings, the emperors, the Shah, the poet, all of them are walking a road he walked first. The most powerful man of his age, master of half a world, reduced in the end to a single figure on a rock in the ocean, staring at the water, with nowhere left to go and no way home. That is the thing about a throne. It can lift you above everyone, and when it falls, it can drop you further than anyone. 10 crowns, 10 exiles, and not one road home that did not run through a foreign grave first. Some of them waited decades in the wrong country's soil before anyone carried them back. Some are waiting still. Like and subscribe, and hit the bell for the next one. Comment which one you think had the hardest exile, and where you are watching from. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.